and they told me what slot I had. I wasn't disappointed, but of the list of things I talk about, this one doesn't really lend itself well to a 5 o'clock conversation, but that's okay. We're going to try and keep it a little interactive for a couple of reasons. A, I prefer to keep most of the events I do like this a bit interactive. The purpose is for you to hopefully walk away with something, and more importantly, something from your peers as well, too, which, when I get into it, you'll understand that this was also built by peers. It's not just to listen to me yammer on because I say, listen to me. So feel free to interrupt at any time, ask questions, and let's go ahead and get started. So, come on in. I want to set the stage by mentioning a few things. So I mentioned built by peers. So when I started building the model almost a year ago at this point, and it took that long, the first thing I did was reached out to a number of my friends in the information security business, some auditors I knew, and then I reached out to some other folks that I didn't really know that well, but they were subject matter experts in either data security and or in data audits and things like that, as well as a couple of folks that I actually had not known at all, but I thought they would also, they'd be well versed in the topic and lend some of their expertise to it. So I've got some folks like Laz, who was really instrumental in helping build the program. Throw a couple of names out there. You might know him, you might not. Anyway, Laz was the former CISO of Sears Online. He's still pretty active in the community. You'll see him out in the community talking quite a bit. He has a lot of experience in this field as well, too. I reached out to my buddy Paul from the University of Oxford across the pond there, because I really wanted to get some insights into the way they've been doing things. And Paul's one of those security practitioners that, and I'm just going to say it, unlike, because I go to a lot of these things, and we get a lot of high-level talks with just more platitudes than I care for. Folks don't really get into the how-to of security. Paul's one of the few folks that built a well-versed security program that covers just sort of all the domains of security. But B, most importantly, he opened it up to the entire community. So everything that they built, documented, you name it, the University of Oxford has put it all up on their website for consumption in one big toolkit under the Creative Commons license as well, too. So Paul's one of those folks that I've actually leaned on now 2 or 3 times in my career when doing these kinds of things to help with. I say these kinds of things because it's not the first maturity model I've done, and certainly not the first security program in general I've done. So if I were to spend couple of seconds on the background about me. I've been in information security for a little while now, and a large part of that has been either as an architect. I started as an ethical hacker, and as most ethical hackers go, you tend to end up somehow in this route. I don't know how that happens, but I don't know, it just kind of happens. So I did that for a while. Ran our own security company for a bit too, because everyone did that in the 2000s, right? Didn't we all? It was a really good time to quit your job and start your own security company. It does not pay nearly as well as anyone would have you believe. It's a lot of work. But I learned a lot. I learned a lot about how to do things, not just in the environments I've been working with, but more specifically, how to take that information and translate it into new environments extremely quickly. And so then I went and I spent a couple of years slaving away in big pharma, and that's kind of when I realized I needed to get back out of corporate America and just kind of relax for a bit. So here I am. I'm the Vice President of Product Strategy for Identity Finder. We are a data loss solution provider. I'll stop there and let you know that first and foremost, the model is vendor agnostic. We'll get to that and you'll see exactly why and how. And that's the other reason why I reached out to all of my peers in the community. It needed to also be intellectually honest. It needed not just be something that was built by a solution provider for the purpose of driving any specific agenda. In fact, throughout the entire model, there is about 1-2 touch points of activities that we directly lend ourselves to versus the entire thing. So you'll see how that all kind of hangs together. And in my spare time, like a lot of other security folks, I like to mix it up on the floor a bit. So at all of the large conferences, about 20 or so of us, if you're ever interested, one of the large conferences, Black Hat or even AppSec USA to that, we like to get together and hit one of the local mixed martial arts gyms. So if you're into it, hit me up. You'd be surprised just how many of them there are out there. Security practitioners that are also... Show of hands. Anyone in here practice at all? There we go. See, that's 2. See?
Yeah.
That guy looks like he could take me out, too. He's not saying anything, but he could. Come on in. We're just getting started. Just tell them just how wonderful I am. You missed that part. But it's being recorded. So instead of just jumping into the model, because it's a little complex, and it doesn't lend itself well to just yammering on and on and on. I actually do host an educational series through my organization. It's a webinar. I do them about every 6 to 8 weeks, where the third one in the series actually goes through the model. The first 2 are an introduction to data security programs. The second one, building data security controls into the programs. And then the last and final one is the model, basically the how to get from A to B. You certainly don't need to have consumed any of that information to participate or pay attention to what's going on here. The reason for that is pretty much everything we do as security practitioners in one way or another comes back to securing data. Right? That is the reason why we have all of the other initiatives that we endeavor on, whether they are perimeter defenses, you've got now behavioral analytics, whatever the case may be, with the exception of maybe some of the malware whose explicit purpose is for stealing resources. Pretty much every other attack, one way or another, lends itself to ultimately getting sensitive data. I even argue that those malware attacks that steal resources, I'm thinking explicitly like the Lizard group that came to fame last year before, where they were selling like DDoS services. There's still a bunch of those guys out there. Right? You can rent DOS services. But even those, although they're stealing your resources, it's for the explicit purpose of stealing another resource for you, right? So making data inaccessible. I'm sure some of you have been along long enough to hear the CIA triad of security, the mantra we preached enough, right? And so both the integrity but the availability of data is also something that needs to be preserved. And so even in that scenario, those types of threats are very important for us to pay attention to. And part of the model, I actually get to some threat modeling, and we can touch on that really quickly. I don't know how. I'll get to asking the audience about that in a little bit more. So I just kind of really quickly threw up some of the data security touch points, and depending on how you slice it, there's 10 to 12 different security domains. They probably all touch security in one way or another. I mean, like I left off things like physical access for obvious reasons, but even that still comes back to data security. But when I look at the responsibilities that I had in similar roles in that either yourselves or folks in your organization have, these are all the different places where data security itself intersects with all of the other domains of security that you're endeavoring on. Why is that important? I mean, outside of the obvious, hanging the process between all these things together is where it gets tricky. And we tend to end up siloing those processes, where the security operations group is solely responsible for responding to incidents or maybe monitoring our DLP solutions. And then you may have a group explicitly that takes care of all of your IAM stuff. And I don't know how your security departments are all divided up, but I've both worked in a number of them and consulted to a number of them, where although they may have all rolled up into one responsibility, the operations group was very separate from the architectural group, was very separate from the identity group. I'm not going to argue whether that's good or bad. It's neither here nor there. In some environments it's necessary, in others it simply isn't. What was necessary, however, was to make sure that the processes were able to hang together across all of those organizations, across all those parts of the organizations. And this is the number one question I get asked. So if I go back really quickly, actually, right? So I mentioned the ops group. More of, you know what? Let's do this. Let me ask the question first. So in your organization, who is responsible for data security? And I don't just mean information security, but data security specifically. What group is ultimately responsible for that? Is it the IT group? Is it the security group? Is it a compliance group? IT? It's the IT department? Yeah. Security? Security groups. You don't look happy when you answer this. We got any regulatory folks in the room? Yeah, maybe. It's okay. I love them too. So back to that high platitude answer. Well, it's everyone's problem. If I hear that one more time at another security conference, it's like, yeah, that's great. That doesn't tell me anything now. What does that tell me about the responsibility of data security? It tells me nothing. I'll pause and rewind to something else, though. So I used to also run the research group for White Hat Security for a number of years. I don't know if you're familiar with their report. So the last 2 years, we decided we were going to go and look at activities versus outcomes. We wanted to see whether or not, again, all these high platitudes of things we were saying were actually having any effect. So we went out to our entire customer base. We went out to a bunch of outsiders, about 1,000 or so folks. We had a list of activities throughout the SDLC, the software development lifecycle, not to be confused with the security lifecycle. And we wanted to compare activities they were doing versus outcomes. Some really interesting things came out of that. One of the most important things that came out of it is a lot of the best practices we were throwing around, they weren't having a negative effect, but most of them certainly weren't having a positive effect. So when we get to this point of, well, whose responsibility is it? Here's the one thing that did come out of both years of those research that unequivocally showed an improvement in security. Whenever there was a central either person or group that was responsible for application security, it was the only thing that we measured that had a positive outcome. I haven't performed the same activity across this particular domain of security yet. It is planned now that the model has been developed, and I'd like to bake it a bit more before I do the same thing, take it out to the community, and perform that activities versus outcomes exercise. But I'm willing to bet that the same is going to come back as being true. That ultimately responsibility does have the greatest impact on outcomes. But again, who's responsible? Well, there's lots of different people responsible. We were saying that, right? I said it. Damn, I said it. I wasn't supposed to say that. It's everyone's responsibility. It is, but everyone's responsibility. Everyone's not responsible for the same thing, and that's where the platitudes just kind of get hung up in the air. And it's like, I get it, everyone's responsible. But what are they responsible for? So then we get into actually building security policies that are based on that. As part of the governance portion of the model, we'll get into where one builds that and some of the resources for doing that. Again, I mentioned Paul and the work that his team did over at Oxford. Great resource for exactly that kind of thing. Policy already completely built. If you have nothing today and you need something similar to that, it's a great starting point. We borrowed some of that and kind of made it a bit more accessible to those that are not just in higher education. But the truth is, higher education is a really good example of an organization that has just about every type of data you can think of. They have PII, lots of it. They have PCI. They have more PCI than lots of places. They are vendors. Some of them are, depending on the size of the university, some of them are level 1 merchants. They're taking in lots of credit card data at the cafeteria, at the bookstore, you name it. They have PHI. Some of them are research universities, so they have lots of healthcare information. They have the healthcare information of their students. They have more data types than most of the other enterprise organizations that I work with. And so another reason why I like Paul's work, because he has to think about all of these things. He has no choice but to think about all of those different data types. The only thing that may be slightly lacking are some of the more obscure forms of intellectual property, but we're not going to get into that either. Certainly not for the purpose of this. We'll talk about how we may want to deal with that from a classification standpoint, but it's certainly not necessary for the purpose of this conversation. So, responsibility. So take the steward, for example, right? That person is responsible for the quality of the data. They draft the standards. The standards have to be signed off on by the owners. That's the owner's responsibility in this entire chain. The steward has that responsibility. Producers have a different set of responsibilities. We very well should have policies that dictate how they handle data, how they generate data. They're the ones that we're oftentimes concerned with where they store data, because that's the first line of data being generated and then finding its way outside of controls that we may have in place. And then consumers, well, that's pretty much all of us. And again, from a consumer perspective, there are other policy guidelines that we need to explicitly have in place. I think I heard this in one of the other talks earlier too. I think maybe it wasn't the keynote. Maybe it was the other talk he was giving on privacy and so on. But ultimately, everyone is going to have that information, and they need to be taught what to do and what not to do. That's not going to happen by itself. So when we're building those policies, we have to explicitly make those things clear. And there's no reason to burden the owners with the same responsibilities as consumers or vice versa and so on. Although everyone's a consumer, they certainly will have some parallels in there. Again, when we talk about the responsibility of data security, it should not fall solely on IT. It should not fall solely on security. Security has a responsibility like everything else. Was that a raising hand I saw? Sorry. Like most things like most tasks throughout the organization, IT should largely be responsible for the I and the A, that is the integrity and availability. Security should be a check on that for the most part, right? They should almost operate kind of as an audit function in that respect. The big A. Make them audit. You'd love that. You'd love that, right? Don't you want to be audit? They got no budget and they go around telling everybody what to do, and then no one listens anyway. All right. I could have named this, and trust me when I tell you I thought about it, yet another security maturity model. Because there are more than a few. There certainly are a number of them. I just threw a few of them on this list. I could think of maybe another half dozen. I think ITIL even has one that although it's largely for technology, they have an entire section on security as well too. NIST certainly has one. I did throw COVID on there. They all exist for different reasons. They all have a certain set of activities that tell us what to do for the explicit purpose of the outcomes they're looking to achieve. So ISO IEC, for example, strictly deals with software development process improvement. It's a good thing. Doesn't deal with data security though. COVID model, that's been around for how long now? 30 years, right? Close to that, I think, easily. That one is courtesy of our friends at ISACA. So that one's been around for a while, but it deals only with the governance and the alignment of IT and the business. An extremely important one, I'd say probably one of the most successful maturity models out there. Much like all of these maturity models, and I'll pick on COVID for a minute, they're not intended to be that prescriptive, and you certainly shouldn't attempt to replicate the entire thing throughout your entire environment. That was never the intent of pretty much most of those models, with the exception maybe of the ones that are dealing specifically with software development. But even those they don't always keep pace with new development methodologies. I know for a fact that that 15504, I think, is still in draft for how they address things like agile development environments versus the old school waterfall. I won't start geeking out on application security. And I don't need anyone already leaving my lovely maturity model 5 o'clock speech, so I'll leave that one alone. But nonetheless, so the sensitive data maturity model, this model was built with similar process improvements in mind, but to go just a layer deeper. It is truly one of my pet peeves that as security practitioners we have such a gap in available resources to tell us how to do things. It's mind-boggling. I don't have an answer for why that is, and I'm not even going to bother attempting to get into it. But the SDMM, much like these, you can adopt part of it, you can adopt all of it. It is a capability model, so it's not a sliding scale of 1 through 5. It is not a you're doing really well or you're doing really poorly. It is meant to measure activities and also provide a roadmap of activities that can get you to certain places of improvement. And so when I looked around for a similar model, certainly was none that existed anywhere. I'm not familiar with one. Everyone I spoke to wasn't familiar with one. if anyone here does know of one, I would be very happy to consume it and look it over. But if I backed up a step, anyone in the room using one of these or a similar model to some small or large degree in their environment? Yeah? No surprise the audit guy's all over that. But for the...
I'm not an auditor.
You're standing the same. That's true. I apologize. I'm not going to do that again. You're like, yeah, he isn't so sure. I didn't mean it that way. So let me ask the obvious question then. As process improvement goes, what are we doing? Can I pick on you?
Let's say we're still largely in the phase of getting it all documented and getting folks to acknowledge that they have to have processes and follow policies. You can't just run around putting out fires.
You certainly cannot. So that's the first phase of any one of these maturity models. That is certainly step one. So anyone in the room slightly more ahead of that game?
We're at the cybersecurity and acute growing maturity model. So we've identified our processes, we've identified where the holes are, the gaps are, and we're working on improving. We're at also.
So you're in the gap analysis phase, basically, of that. It's perfect. I mentioned there were 3 parts of the series. Part 2, I spent probably a solid 45 minutes going through the gap analysis process. Extremely important. I'm not going to touch on those things very intentionally. Well, A, I don't have enough time, and B, I'm making a few assumptions about what you have or don't have. More importantly, I want to introduce the model first and foremost. Although if you are interested, again, there's the webinar, but at each of the national ISACA conferences, I will be going through the model in its entirety, hosting some workshops as well as presenting it. So I don't know when they are. It's later in the year. There's one in the U.S. in Vegas. If you hate Vegas as much as I do, maybe I don't see you there. The other one's in London, and then like one in Singapore or something. So
Just curious, is one of those? My former job, we did a lot of this, and we were successful doing improvements. Is one of these related to like the Carnegie Mellon version? Are you familiar with that or not?
is that CMMI?
Yes.
So COIS, which is owned and ran by ISACA, they just bought CMMI. They did. And actually, I got a phone call from them this week because, again, I'm presenting all of this at the conference. They were like, so Gabe, it's not going to conflict with CMMI, is it? Like, no, it's not. Very intentionally, it wasn't built as a model to conflict with anything existing. Again, I saw a need to fill a gap. That was it. And so I'm actually going to spend some time this week in doing it. I'm going to map about as much as I can of the SDMM to CMMI. Pardon the acronym soup. I forget exactly fully what CMMI stands for, but it is the Carnegie Mellon Maturity, something or the other. So I haven't spoken to them yet. I don't know what their intents for it are, but now that ISACA owns that and the COVID model, I expect to see some integrating of the two, where COVID largely focused on IT and CMMI focused heavily on security. I'm hoping that those two models do get married in some degree and find some maturity of their own. Now that I know that, I plan on spending some time over the next few months seeing if I can't worm my way into that project and maybe even influence a little bit to make sure, again, that some of those gaps remain filled. So to answer your question, CMMI is not directly correlated with any of these. The best way to describe the Carnegie Mellon one, if anyone's familiar with ITIL, right, Information Technology Information Library, the CMMI model kind of picks up where ITIL leaves off. So where ITIL gives us this very prescriptive way of rolling out IT processes and security processes in our environment, CMMI tells us how to go about improving those things over time. And it's probably, in my opinion, a bit more prescriptive on how to even start. So here's how I put it. ITIL really is at it's at the director level and above, if you would, right? And they even break it down that way. They have program managers and things of that sort. They should be concerned with the way all those things hang together. If we went back to our responsibilities chart, actually, so it starts here. This person's relevant, but then in the ITIL format, the stakeholders are largely the actual, what's the strong word they use? They call them project something than the others. Anyway, we're bringing you with more maturity models. And you're asking yourself, how does that man stay married? I don't know the answer to that, actually. No clue. So yeah, it's related. I've never tried mapping it to any of the others, so I'd be curious how it maps. And now that I know they own it, I'm going to spend some time this weekend mapping it to my own just to see where some of the things overlap. Here's what I can say about the Carnegie Mellon one versus the one I'm finally going to get to, is that I'm intentionally looking at activities, and I have them bucketed by business functions and broken down then by security practices, where Carnegie Mellon is looking at just the business function activities. So you'll see how it breaks down. Let's get to it. I don't really need to talk about the why, right? This is the why. Fill a gap. It doesn't exist. Provide a measuring stick for data security. Specifically data security, not to be confused with just information security in general and all of the other domains of security, but I want to measure how well I'm protecting data and the activities around them. And document those data security process improvements. So just like you're starting out with actually telling the organization, here are the things we're going to do, here are the things we should be doing, and writing them down. That's part of the reason why we started this, so that there was a framework for, here are the activities you may want to consider doing. It is by no means completely inclusive, which is why, like all of the models, you shouldn't just attempt to pick them up and put them down. They're not very good at that. I put the how before the model breakdown because I just kind of wanted to give you an idea of some of the other artifacts of the model. So first off, completely open sourced it as well too. So it is available under Creative Commons 4.0 share and share alike, non-commercial. So anyone can use it. They can take it, do whatever you want with it. You can create your own versions of it. Other vendors can do the same thing. There's the only limitations of CC 4.0 non-commercial is that they have to credit the source, and you can't profit from it. That's it. It's really simple. There's an assessment worksheet. Kind of get a snapshot of that. That steps through a number of questions. I didn't create a questionnaire. Will I? Maybe. You can create the questionnaire from the worksheet. The worksheet highlights the activities, and basically you choose whether those are being performed, not performed, reactive, measured, controlled, and so on. So there's an assessment worksheet. There's a document that explains the entire model. There's a document that explains how to use the worksheet. From there, you get artifacts. You can perform the assessment across the entire organization. You can break it down by the different business units. Again, as we continue to have it adopted and used, I very much intend to do the same thing I did with some of my past research. I want to be able to go out and then compare actual activities across different organizations versus outcomes and so on. We know what works in different environments. Some things here, some things there. What I don't know yet, though, is how well everything works and in what environments, and how does that compare to, say, the different verticals that are adopting it. So we wanted to start with a framework that simply addressed the data security, and then we build from there. So there's an assessment worksheet, things that explain it, so on and so forth. So the what? What is the actual model? So this is the model. The model is broken down across 4 business functions: governance, vision, validation, implementation. Relatively self-explanatory, yeah, right? So the governance function is concerned with all the things you mentioned. So my policy management. Am I documenting all of the things that need to occur within the organization? Across that chart that dictated the who, have I explained to everyone what they are responsible for? Have I documented, and again, when we don't want to confuse guidelines with policies, right? I'm not going to get into that conversation either. That's for boot camp number 2. But that's a very important thing. So if that's being conflated in the organization at all, make sure that you're explicitly writing policies and not guidelines based on what you're looking to do. Vision. So security design, standards and requirements, modeling data threat actors. I'm not going to touch on all of them. I'll pick on 2. Standards and requirements. So those aren't to be confused with the governance functions of defining these standards throughout the organization. Those are security standards, so those start getting close to my controls. And modeling data threat actors. So anyone in here at all doing any threat modeling, period? Threat modeling at all? doing some threat modeling. Awesome. I am a little, yeah, too? No? So that's certainly activity that more security operations, not even operations, you could put it anywhere in the organization, but it's certainly an activity that more security organizations should be adopting. It largely began as an activity that was performed against software because we were explicitly defining boundaries around the things we were building and how we were looking at the different attacks that they were facing. How about red team activities? Folks doing any of that? Yeah. Okay, doing some of that. External penetration activities? Yeah, okay. So if you look at like an external pen test, right? Part of what they explicitly would start out doing would be building a data threat model. I don't know if they share that with you as part of the results. Truth be told, I didn't often do so as part of my reports, largely because the reports were going to either mid-level managers or senior folks that really weren't that interested in how I modeled the threat. They just wanted to know the outcomes. Modeling the threat against your environment, something we've been doing for a while. We have a pretty good understanding of that. Modeling threats against software, getting a hell of a lot better at that too. Explicitly modeling the threats against the data is a whole new set of activities that, I gotta be honest with you, based on the response here, I don't know where in the model I should keep it any longer. It's important. You should be doing it. But ultimately, you should be doing that activity across all the things I just mentioned. You should be doing it across your infrastructure. You should be doing it across your software environment. You may not have the resources to do all of it, but you certainly can perform the exercise on paper, which is actually all I'm talking about doing here. So I'm just modeling the threat. I'm not actually performing the vulnerability exercise. I'm not actually going out and executing it. I'm just looking at the different ways attackers are looking at getting to my data and what they value in getting to it. Modeling that threat out and then using that as a mechanism for determining where I may place controls. The documentation, again, gets a little deeper into that. I'm going to take this opportunity to do a little querying of the audience for my own selfish purposes. Would folks actually find a workshop on data threat modeling useful? No. So. Gonna do it anyway. So then. The problem is if we're not even modeling our threats against any of the other types of data, then yeah, it certainly may be too advanced of an activity. But that's okay because the model is designed to account for that. And it doesn't somehow ding you if you're not performing that activity. Again, it's a capability model. It is not one that says you passed or fail. That does nothing. It especially does nothing when you're attempting to use that to explain to your stakeholders and your senior management what the resources are that you need. Because most folks simply wouldn't show that to them if came back with a failing rate anyway. And again, it's about the activities, what we're doing, what we're not doing, where we want to improve, and why. Validation. You can consider that your internal audit functions. It's not a bad word, and it's a very necessary activity. So, are we doing any of the things that we said we were doing? And are we doing those things not just across the people, but the process and the technology as well, too? So we have to have those internal validators. I would argue that, again, that should live with security operations. That's the SecOps team's job. Those are the things they should be looking at. Monitoring of user privilege activity, auditing and reporting, monitoring of file content. Are you doing any of those right now? You being all of you, right? So I promise you, the model has activities built in that most of us are performing to some degree. Again, it was all about hanging it all together to understand the breadth of our data security activities. I'm a big mind map guy. Everything kind of starts here. So I only put this up so that you can see what the model looks like visualized outwards. So my governance function. And then I broke out data security policy management, right? So I had my business function, security practice, and now I'm going to pull out from the security practice data security policy management. There are 4. There's one dead laptop. There are 4 levels of activities ranging from not perform, reactive, proactive, measured and controlled. So as data security policy management goes, in the reactive state, the process of handling sensitive data is defined, agreed upon, and communicated to all stakeholders. I'd argue that's where you're at right now. You're currently in the reactive stage of the data security policy management phase of the governance business function. That's a good thing. You are ultimately trying to get all the way over to the measure and control stage, where data security policies are mapped to your actual compliance regulations. So you know the things that you have to do because you've been told you have to do them by some compliance regulation. We all have that to some degree, especially if we have at an absolute minimum PII. You haven't. You certainly haven't. We may have other types of data, PHI and so on. And getting to that measure and control state means that you have bridged the gap between defining those things and making sure that those align with the things that you have to do. I'd argue that that's one of the relatively easier security practices in that business function to achieve maturity in. But it's one of those that I would also argue is not optional. You don't have to do the data threat modeling. But if you're failing in this part of the maturity model, if you are at the not performing stage, I didn't even put it up there. Right? I just did the reactive, proactive, measure, and control. But if you're at the not performing, well, I'll tell you this much. You're failing your audits already. And you're only a phone call away from getting a fine. Literally, that's it. At least from an auditory perspective, you'd be dinged for not having at least be at the proactive stage where you have those policies in place. It would be more of a finding, but it certainly wouldn't. It might not be finable. You're shaking your head like, yeah, it's a finding.
I'm a convert auditor, so.
Congratulations. How many years? No, I'm kidding. And how long have you been out? So yes, so you are at least in a phase where it would be a finding, but you don't have to worry about the phones ringing and checks having to be written and so on. And in the middle of that is the proactive stage, where verifying policy, understanding across the organization through custom testing and tracking and through software. So what does that mean? So that means you've written that policy, and now we're going to check and make sure that those things are understood throughout the environment. There's a lot of ways you can do that. So let's back up also. Getting to measure and control always means that we need to automate as much of this as humanly possible. As much as possible. Not all of it because we can't, and not all of it because we shouldn't, and not all of it because that's just money you're throwing out the door, not necessarily for a good reason. But we can do things, for example, in this stage, like and we might already do this. I mean, I know pretty much all of the Fortune 100 organizations I've worked with. Once a year, I have to go into my corporate learning management system, my LMS, and I have to go over Blue Book policies, and I have to click, yes, I understand that, yes, I understand that. We're probably more familiar with that as it pertains to HR policies, but that doesn't largely happen from a data security policy perspective. So it becomes impossible to hold someone accountable for performing an activity that we never told them they should be doing, and we never validated that they were doing. We don't need to start firing people because they mishandled sensitive data. However, if I have a security operations team, not picking on you, not at all, I promise I'm not. Again, I too am a SecOps man. But they need to understand that it's their job to enforce those policies. And I need to verify that they understand that. That should happen upon hiring. And once in a while, we should check in and say, we still good? That everyone understands how that happens? It doesn't necessarily have to be through an LMS. In another organization, we should just do it as part of a performance review, right? It was one of your management objectives. It was one of your MBOs. Like, all right, do you understand that you have to be enforcing this policy? Yes, and that the operational task that you're undergoing should always have an eye on those things. Yes, so that's the proactive stage of the data security policy management. And then the other two security practices all break out the same way as well. So in the activity worksheet, you'll see all that. I truncated this because the only thing worse than 5 o'clock talk on maturity models is me yammering on every single security practice. But I wanted to give everyone an understanding of what they are. And so I pulled one out for each group. I feel like I should gloss over the modeling of data threat actors, but I also feel like I should explain it anyway, and why why not only myself, but many of my peers felt it as important as they did. It's worth noting that of the 12 people that were part of the original project, there are only 3 of them that were actually doing this in their environments as well. It's not to say that everyone didn't agree on it. Everyone agreed, everyone collaborated on this, but there were literally only 3 people that rephrase that. There were 2 that were actually doing it. One that had been doing it at their past organization, were not doing it at their current organization. So it is not one of those activities that I expect, or that should be expected, folks to necessarily be measured and controlled. And more importantly, every organization should define for themselves which of these are the ones that they feel they need to get to that advanced stage of, based on their risk tolerance, based on their organizational profile, based on all of those things. This is not Gabe and 12 men in a smoky room, actually 9 men and 3 women in a smoky room, telling folks what they should do. So in the reactive stage, threat actors are identified post-incident, after the breach. So that's probably something that we're all familiar with, right? We start when we go through either the incident response phase of this, or when we go through the forensic phase of an incident or a breach. That's when we actually start performing this activity. I didn't lay a landmine, but the truth is, most organizations are doing this, just doing it way too late in their process. After something happens, they go back and they try to understand, and they try to map out what happened, how it happened, what was the threat against that data, and then they work their way backwards. Certainly reactive. Look, it's something we still have to perform. Post-incident, post-breach, you are going to have to do that. The model says, if you want to get to a proactive or a measured and control state of this, you should be doing that much sooner in your processes. If you found the time and money to do it post-incident, you probably could have devoted some amount of resources. That's not fair. Maybe you couldn't. There's certainly no shortage of other things we have to be doing, right? So I shouldn't be that. All right, so the proactive stage is modeling data of threat actors is based upon request by business and or entity upon alerts from various other sources, example, so on. So in this scenario, in the reactive scenario, we may have gotten an alert from our SIM. We may have gotten an alert from our threat intel feed. We may have gotten something else that told us there is a possible threat to our environment. Have a look at what it's trying to get to, how it's trying to get to there, why it's trying to do that, so on and so forth. So again, to some degree, we're already performing some of that activity. We are modeling the threat against it. We're not formally modeling the threat. When I talk about a formal modeling of it, there's actual software that you can use to model threats. Microsoft has their tool. It's based solely on, that one's largely for software, but you certainly could use it for this. Mozilla has one that, I want to say it's University of Arizona. A couple of grad students there put together. There aren't many, but you absolutely could. You could just hack it like I do and use a mind map solution to do that as well. Mine of choice is MindJet. No affiliation. I don't get paid for that plug. I just happen to like it for a number of reasons. It's really powerful. There are lots of free solutions for doing that. So in the proactive stage, we're modeling those data threats, but we're doing so after some other part of our infrastructure has told us that there's a threat that we need to be worried about. That's a good thing. For many organizations, you could stop here. You very well could stop here, as long as you had the process in place that once that similar came, that once that surge information came in, once that threat intel feed came, that you perform this activity. Many organizations very well should stop there and not even attempt to get any higher, because you may be diverting resources from something else. Questions? And finally, the measured control state, modeling of threat actors is built into the core process to determine where the company could be exploiting. Modeling is part of the active process, and what did I say? And with the mature security team. It is difficult to get to. It is not something that you should divert resources from unless unless you certainly have the rest of your operations and your architecture teams humming along quite nicely. But I would argue that for this one in particular, you should at a minimum be reaching for the proactive stage. Absolutely the proactive stage. Same thing. I wanted to give you the visualization. So I got some feedback that this was a little, didn't really translate well. These abbreviations in the left column, this is how they're defined and laid out in the assessment tool. So they're just all abbreviated, so it's really easy to track and communicate what's what to folks. So we've got the validation business function, and monitoring of file content is, that's the security practice. In the reactive stage of this in particular, monitoring of file content is a manual process performed ad hoc, on an ad hoc basis. So what does this really mean? It means that the folks in HR, when they open a document, when they start putting together a document, they're the ones that tag that information as being sensitive in some degree. They're manually saying this thing has PII in it. And they have either some manual mechanism for doing that, maybe they save it in the notes, maybe they put it in the header, confidential PII, or maybe there is even a manual solution that does that for them. So in the reactive stage, that's the activity they're performing. Again, another show of hands. How many folks are at an absolute minimum? There are those with those critical functions of handling sensitive data, such as PII and an HR function, that are marking that data as being so. It's good. It's excellent. All right. So again, a number of these activities, I expect that some folks are doing to some degree. And if they're not, again, the purpose of the model was to give folks a framework for understanding where they should be doing these things and what that thing is, as opposed to in high-level platitudes that just drive grades.
So are you talking about data classification specifically?
Doesn't have to be.
On a document-to-document basis.
I'm talking about both. At the reactive stage, you are way down just the document to document, because all you're doing is manually having folks identify that file as being sensitive because they know it contains X. So I am talking about both. You need to have.
Well, you need to at least know what your sensitive data is to be able to find it, right? Because it may differ from one organization.
And this is where that activity would be performed, right? So we need to, as part of our governance activities, we have to define that well before we can get down here and do those things. You're spot on. You're absolutely correct. You have to be able to say, you're doing this, right? You build that into your policy.
Because, I mean, that's what we're trying to look at is, I want to call PII the base. So it's social sensitive no matter what. But it might also fall into procedures or HIPAA, one of the other models. But if you draw that baseline and you build your silos up there for the different business units and the applications that have those data sets, you have a core thing where anybody in the organization can know that certain things are sensitive. And then beyond that, the units that handle certain data types need to know more about what they have.
Yeah, I mean, in some organizations, your databases, your very flat databases will have sensitive pieces of information hidden all over the place.
Absolutely.
The only way to control that is with a real classification program.
That would be a good workshop.
Yes.
I already host that workshop. I'm not kidding. Somewhat biased. It is actually what we do as an organization. But as a solution provider, my job specifically isn't just to throw things at you and tell you go do that. My job is also to help you be successful in exactly doing that. And so there actually is a workshop just on the data classification portion of it. Currently up to those 4. I don't know how many more I'm going to squeeze in. It depends on the need, but you're right. And the reason why both we exist in that sense and why the workshop itself exists, and I will say, because I always feel the need to kind of do that, it is very vendor agnostic. We're talking about the process of building it out, not what you use to accomplish that. There are lots of ways you can go about that. Do we believe we do it the better? Sure. But that's a completely different conversation. You still need to understand how to do that, the requirements for doing that, the pitfalls of having, I queried just a couple of people today, classification schemas that had 2 identifiers as hours or not hours. Yeah, that's not going to work. And then I've seen folks that attempted to have one that were 20 deep, and it's like, yes, so that's not going to work either. You can't have a classification schema that is granular. But there is no one number. There isn't. It needs to be private, confidential. There is no one number. It again has to be based on what you build off of your security policy management. And when you get to that mature stage of the data security policy management, you're going to start again tying those things to also regulatory needs, right? And so your classification scheme, as you start working your way down, should and would be based on that. So you're absolutely right. So now you kind of see how the model starts pulling all those things together. Yeah, I need to be doing that, but that has to be part of, in order for me to get to that stage, I may need to mature where I am, my security practices under that governance function there as well too. But now you can start mapping a roadmap to how I get there, as opposed to on Monday morning, hey, I got to do this thing, and then next Tuesday it's like, oh crap, I have to go do that thing, right? Answer your question again? Yes, that's what I was talking about. A classification. So when we get to the proactive stage, monitoring of file content becomes automated. There's any number of ways you can do that. Again, there certainly are solutions that do that. Yes, we have a solution that does that. We're not the unicorn in the block. That's not the point. In order for you to get out of this stage and get proactive, you're going to have to automate it. A couple of reasons. Reason number one, you're going to run into folks who underclassify everything because they want to not have the information not be able to be shared around the organization and so on. It's getting in my way. It's all whatever your lowest classification is. Then you're going to get folks who overclassify everything, and that too is going to block all kinds of business processes because they don't want to be the ones responsible for anything happening. So once policies are built, we then want to automate the process of enforcing those, and we certainly can couple it with some of the reactive stage activities still. There's no reason to completely can the stuff from the first stage. You may still need to do those things in the reactive stage while you're in the proactive stage. You may do them together. But you do need to be able to automate some of that so that you can enforce those controls. We do the same thing pretty much in all the other domains of security where we start automating security processes, right? The same was applied to this. So yes, so now we've defined what our policies were. We took our policies and we said, based on our policies, here's the classification schema, and here's how the information breaks down across its levels of sensitivity. And now we know how we want to handle that data. So then we go out back way, I don't know how many slides ago, we tell all of the people involved in the process what their responsibility is for adhering to that, and then doing so based on that being your policy, and also doing so based on the classification that you built. We have that in place. As we attempt to mature that throughout the organization, because again, this isn't just security, and in fact, if we're doing this right, I just made his life easier. Nothing got easier. Then we start automating that and excuse me, and make it to that next stage. In the measure and control stage, file content is automatically monitored, classified based on company and regulatory policy, and security controls are automatically enforced based on content. That's the panacea. It really isn't the panacea. It's achievable. It depends both on scale, and it certainly depends on having all of those other things defined. So in the measure and control state, let's walk through the whole thing now. You've defined the policy based on the company needs, regulatory needs, so on. A classification scheme was built based on that. We started automating that, as well as having folks that are responsible for the data owners and creators also manually identifying the data, but now we started automating some of that process. And now we're going to apply that to our security controls. So now we're going to have, whether it's our traditional DLP tools, if it's our encryption tools, whatever the security control is that you want to place around those data types based on the policies, now we're going to have that come full circle as part of our operation, right? So now I'm going to be able to say, I have a document that's classified as having PCI information in it. That information should not live outside of my CDE, my cardholder data environment. I need you to automatically quarantine that thing or shred it or redact it and so on. Same thing goes for HR data. There's no reason HR data should reside on your machine. You're not even in HR. How did it get there? Because it was on some file share that someone saved it there too. And it's like, well, that's an interesting name. Salaries. Yeah, I gotta see what's going on in that thing. Right? And so I save it. Happens all the time, right? It's no shortage of times that happens. I save that data somewhere else. Go for it.
So this seems to be where the complication comes in for a lot of organizations, particularly ours, where you have a lot of homegrown software. Well, I'm in insurance, and now unless I'm going to go back and rewrite my homegrown apps, how am I going to tag the data so that I can control. There isn't really a good way to do that. So that you end up looking at DLP integration tools that run as different layers of infrastructure to try to do that instead of rewriting your apps. Is that the trend you see, or I mean, can you give us feedback on that?
There aren't a lot of file types that you couldn't write that information into. So when you say homegrown apps, what's the data types that it's working off of? Are these flat files? Are they RTF files? Are they Excel documents? What are they? Are they databases? All right, so still, you can go through the database and still tag it. I never suggest that you do that in the database because I don't want to touch or change that information. I don't ever really want to write to the database. To say the least of, now I also have another operational issue where now I have to get DBs and all kinds of other things. However, I can index that database against the information I know it's in there and have that classification live in the same central environment that all of my other flat files are. No need to rewrite anything. I mean, here's the only place where I run into serious challenges is when that database itself is something homegrown. When that database itself is something that someone hacked together, or it's some proprietary database. I mean, if you can do a connection to that database, though, there's no reason you can't query it and look at what's in there.
Yeah, but that's still going to be modifying your homegrown apps. It's still going to be modifying your business logic in order to how to handle the sensitive data. Was it displayed in this application?
Okay.
That's the complication.
All right. So I think I was getting ahead of you and ahead of myself here. So I've identified the homegrown app. I've identified the database where that sensitive information lives. I've queried it. I've now started classifying it from that information in the system that says column A in special database has this type of information. Now you're talking about applying the security control to it. What do I do then? So you're right. Depending on what the control is you want to add around it, here's my suggestion. If it's a completely homegrown app, attempting to apply a modern security control to it is going to be difficult without rewriting it, right? I can't just automatically start going in and encrypting things and masking it. I mean, there might be some masking solutions that might help you out. I don't know.
Or even worse, the COTS app that you have no control over, which is where we are. Source code is out.
Yeah. Then you need to protect access to and from the data. I don't treat that any differently than I treat big data environments right now, where I'm more concerned with who and what has access to the information versus how I'm going to put the controls around it. So now it is applying the appropriate control. To hell with all the other types of controls you could put, forget masking, tokenization. You really want to focus in that case on access. That's what it's going to come down to. And the biggest challenge there in terms of access is machine access. Because there's going to be, if you've got legacy COT stuff in there, you're going to have machine access from something some dude connected 20 years ago, whatever it is. I'm exaggerating now. So start looking at the connections to those things. Look at what is accessing it in that case. That is certainly not the easiest challenge to solve, but I would argue that what you do in that scenario is you narrow the controls that you're looking to apply to it. You're going to have to. You're going to have to. But when you're building your business justification, when you're assessing your tolerance for risk and so on, and looking at how you're actually mitigating threats based on your controls, at least now you can say why you did that and how you did that. It's like, well, because of this, we did these. But in these other environments, and here's where sometimes things fall down. It's like, you know what? If that's all I can do is control access, because I have all these old COT systems, then a lot of programs will just roll that out across the board and say, well, then we're just going to do that for everything. And that's when you start falling down. That's where the gaps and the chinks in the armor start to exist. I think I'm running short on time, which is okay. Near the end, I was going to go through some event detection analysis and alerting. Again, I just pulled out one security practice for each business process, just to give you guys an idea of what the model looks like. Ultimately, to get the full understanding of it, you certainly should hit our website, grab a copy of it, reach out to me. If you can make it to one of my longer workshops and talks where I actually go into it, then we can do that. I didn't anticipate that in the time we had today we could look at every single business function and all the security practices. So I think I'll wrap it there, unless there's any other questions. Yeah.
Okay. So the biggest challenge I see